Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world awash with suffering, whether it's war-torn Gaza, starving children in Yemen, or broken families in refugee camps. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, there are voices, unlikely voices sometimes, that reach across boundaries of faith, fame, and fortune to remind us of our shared humanity. Angelina Jolie's humanitarian journey has taken her far beyond the glamour of Hollywood. While most know her as an actress, it is her work as a UNH, see our Goodwill Ambassador, and later as Special Envoy, that has brought her into direct contact with some of the most painful and heartbreaking human experiences. From Syrian refugee camps to the aftermath of genocides in Rwanda and Darfur, Jolie has witnessed first-hand the deep and often overwhelming presence of human suffering. In those raw and unsanitized spaces, places untouched by fame or film, Jolie encountered stories of unimaginable loss, grief, and survival. It is within this landscape of global human pain that she found an unexpected companion, the Quran. For Jolie, who was not raised within any rigid religious framework, reading the Quran was not an exercise in devotion, but a search for understanding. She sought a deeper framework to process what she had seen. What does it mean to suffer? Why do the innocent bear the weight of conflict, war, and displacement? And where does one find meaning or moral clarity in the face of such brutal injustice? The Quran, in its profound simplicity and spiritual depth, addresses these questions directly. Suffering in the Quranic world is not an aberration. It is part of the human condition. It is both a test and a teacher. Unlike many modern attitudes that treat suffering as something to be either erased or ignored, the Quran recognizes it as a path to personal and spiritual growth. This struck a deep chord with Jolie. In Surah Al-Baqarah 2:155, the Quran states, "And we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger, and a loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the patient." This verse does not offer shallow comfort. It acknowledges the harsh reality that suffering will come in many forms: loss, fear, hunger, and that these experiences are not punishments but tests, and crucially, it emphasizes patience and resilience in response. In Jolie's world, filled with mothers who had lost children, children who had lost limbs, and families who had lost entire homes, this perspective resonated. She began to see suffering not just as tragedy, but as testimony. The people she met were not defined solely by what they had lost, but by how they endured. In refugee camps across the Middle East and Africa, Jolie often remarked on the spiritual strength of those who had lost everything. Many of them were Muslims, drawing strength from their faith, quoting verses from the Quran even as their worlds lay in ruins. She began to notice how central the Quran was not just as scripture, but as emotional sustenance. It wasn't simply that these people were religious. It was that their faith gave them a context for their pain. Their suffering had meaning, and more importantly, it had a purpose. The Quran teaches that suffering can purify the soul, humble the arrogant, and strengthen the bonds of community. It calls on the privileged to respond not with pity, but with action. In Surah Al-Insan 76:8-9, the Quran praises those who give to the needy purely out of compassion, saying, "And they give food in spite of love for it to the needy, the orphan, and the captive, saying, We feed you only for the countenance of Allah. We wish not from you reward or gratitude." This deeply altruistic ethic moved Jolie. In many ways, it reflected the very humanitarian ideal she was working toward: aid without ego, service without expectation. Another profound insight Jolie drew from the Quran was its universal approach to the human experience. The Quran does not speak only to Arabs or Muslims, it speaks to human beings. The language of its verses often addresses mankind broadly, with phrases such as "O mankind" or "O people." This universalism appealed to Jolie, who saw first and how pain does not discriminate, how it strikes regardless of race, religion, or nationality. In Islam, suffering is not a curse reserved for the wicked or a mark of divine disfavor. It is part of life's design, often unintelligible in the moment but part of a greater moral and spiritual architecture. This understanding allowed Jolie to approach suffering not with nihilism or despair, but with perspective. It changed how she listened to the stories of the displaced. Where some might see victims, she began to see people walking through a sacred test. People exercising resilience in ways that, as she once hinted, might even put the rest of the world to shame. She also came to admire how the Quran did not romanticize suffering, but neither did it render the sufferer powerless. It equipped people with the mental and spiritual tools to endure. Angelina Jolie's own experiences with personal pain, her complicated relationship with her father, her health scares, her public divorce, pale in comparison to the war zones she visited, but they are not irrelevant. Personal suffering, even for someone as privileged as Jolie, is still real, and the Quran, in speaking so eloquently to the broken-hearted, became a source of quiet strength. In Surah Al-Shah 94, 5-6, it says, "For indeed with hardship will be ease. Indeed with hardship will be ease." This repetition is intentional. It affirms that suffering is never the end of the story. To Jolie, this message was not abstract theology. It was practical wisdom. She saw the truth of it in the resilience of women rebuilding homes in Syria, in the determination of children studying in tents with no electricity, and in the grace of men who had lost their families but still managed to smile. The Quran had already told them, suffering is real, but so is ease. The more she read, the more she realized that this sacred text offered not just religious doctrine, but a psychological and emotional framework for enduring trauma. The Quran was not merely a book of rituals, it was a book of real life. And in that way it helped Jolie not only understand the people she was trying to help, but also herself. Suffering, she came to believe, is not just something to be relieved. It is something to be understood. And through the Quran, she found a powerful guide. In her many years as a humanitarian, Angelina Jolie has been exposed to the rawest forms of human cruelty and the heaviest emotional burdens that conflict zones can inflict. She has met children who have seen their parents killed before their eyes, women who have survived sexual violence as a weapon of war, and entire communities uprooted by political chaos. In facing these tragedies, Jolie repeatedly asked herself a question: where is mercy in all of this? In a world drowning in war, vengeance and trauma, is mercy still relevant? And if so, where can we find a framework that makes sense of it practically and spiritually? The answer, for Jolie, increasingly came from the pages of the Quran. One of the most striking features of the Quran is how deeply embedded the concept of mercy is in its structure and message. In fact, nearly every chapter of the Quran begins with the phrase, "In the name of Allah," the most compassionate, the most merciful. This repetition is not rhetorical flair. It is theological emphasis. It establishes from the very beginning that mercy is not simply a human virtue, but a divine attribute, and more than that, it is the primary attribute of God. That alone reshaped Jolie's perception of religious faith. Instead of seeing God as a figure of wrath, as often portrayed in harsh narratives, the Quran introduced her to a model of divinity whose core traits are mercy and compassion. This understanding influenced how Jolie interpreted her own humanitarian mission. If mercy is at the center of God's relationship with creation, then surely it must also be at the center of how human beings treat one another. It affirmed something she had begun to feel instinctively in her travels, that true change, whether in policy or in human behavior, begins with compassion, not control, not fear, not even justice in the narrow sense, but mercy. Mercy sees the other not just as a victim, but as a soul worthy of dignity, no matter their past or present condition. The Quran pushes this principle further by making mercy not just a passive feeling, but an active responsibility. It commands believers to be merciful to others because God is merciful to them. In Surah Al-Araf 7:56, it says, "Indeed, the mercy of Allah is near to the doers of good." It is not enough to feel pity. Mercy is an action. Jolie saw this echoed in the efforts of countless Muslim aid workers she met. People distributing food, rebuilding homes, offering education in refugee camps. Many of them did so not for money or prestige, but because their faith compelled them to embody God's mercy on earth. This left a deep impression on her. It showed her that mercy is not weakness. It is a form of strength, quiet, deliberate, and incredibly powerful. In war zones like Iraq and Syria, where Jolie spent time documenting the impact of terrorism and displacement, she encountered people who had lost everything but refused to become bitter or vengeful. When asked why, many of them referenced the Quran's emphasis on forgiveness and mercy even toward those who wrong you. One of the most cited verses among them was from Surah Ash-Shura 42:40, "But whoever pardons and makes reconciliation, his reward is due from Allah." This was difficult for Jolie to process at first. In Western paradigms, justice is often seen as synonymous with punishment. But in these Quranic teachings, justice includes, and in some cases prefers, restraint, forgiveness, and reconciliation. This didn't mean, of course, that the Quran condoned injustice. On the contrary, it is filled with passionate calls for the defense of the weak and oppressed. But it balances that with a higher ethic, one that aims not merely at retribution, but at healing. For Jolie, who had seen the limits of military intervention and international diplomacy, this spiritual approach to justice held a certain appeal. It was not naive, it was deeply human. She also noticed how the Quran speaks about mercy in layers, not just between humans, but between people and the environment, between nations, and even between animals and humans. In Islamic tradition, derived from both the Quran and the Hadith sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, acts of mercy to animals are regarded as acts of worship. Jolie, an advocate for conservation and wildlife protection, found this particularly resonant. It underscored the interconnectedness of all life and that mercy is not a selective ethic. It is a universal one. More subtly, Jolie began to appreciate how the Quran speaks of mercy in personal, psychological terms. Mercy isn't only what we extend to others, it is also what we hope to receive when we are broken. In Surah Az-Zumar 39:53, the Quran delivers one of its most consoling verses. Say, O my servants who have transgressed against themselves by sinning, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. Jolie has often spoken about carrying emotional scars from her childhood, her family, and the burden of witnessing global suffering. For her, this verse was not abstract doctrine, it was an invitation to hope. It offered a kind of forgiveness that was absolute, not transactional, not conditional. This was radically different from the harsh moralizing she had sometimes seen in religious discourse. In the Quran, mercy is not the exception. It is the rule. She also drew inspiration from the character of the Prophet Muhammad as described in the Quran. In Surah Al-Anbiya 21:107, he is called a mercy to all the worlds. Jolie, who had seen how charismatic leaders and influencers shaped global narratives, was moved by this image, a leader not defined by conquest or domination, but by mercy. It reminded her of the kind of leadership the world is so often lacking today. Leaders who serve rather than rule, who listen rather than shout, and who forgive rather than punish. All of these insights gradually shaped the way Jolie understood her mission, her audience, and even herself. She began to speak more frequently about the role of compassion in policy making, about how mercy should not be confined to religion, but infused into law, aid, and diplomacy. And while she never converted to Islam, her respect for the Quran's moral depth became clear in her interviews and speeches. She acknowledged that reading it had deepened her capacity to understand what real compassion looks like, especially in places where most people would see only horror. In a time when mercy is often dismissed as soft or sentimental, Jolie found in the Quran a countercultural message. Mercy is the foundation of justice, the precondition for peace, and the language through which humanity survives its own darkness. For much of the Western world, Islam is often viewed through a prism of fear, suspicion, and misunderstanding. Media coverage in the post-9/11 era has, in many cases, focused almost exclusively on extremism, conflict, and geopolitical tension, usually placing Islam, and by extension the Quran, at the center of the narrative. This has left millions of people with the impression that the Quran is a book of violence, that Islam is a religion of hostility, and that Muslim identity is somehow incompatible with modern values or universal ethics. Angelina Jolie's experience sharply challenges this narrative, not because she set out to prove anything, but because she did something rare. She read the Quran for herself. What makes Jolie's case so striking is that she is neither a Muslim nor a scholar of Islamic theology. She is a Western woman, an actress born into fame, and someone who has lived a very public life under intense scrutiny. Yet through her humanitarian work with the United Nations, she encountered Muslims not as media stereotypes, but as real people, families shattered by war, women rebuilding their lives, children starving but still smiling, and communities holding on to hope. Over time, her empathy led her to curiosity, and her curiosity led her to read the very book that inspired many of the people she was helping, the Quran. Jolie has shared in interviews and conversations that reading the Quran gave her new insight, not only into the religion of Islam, but into the inner strength, patience and moral clarity of the people she had met in refugee camps, war zones and destroyed cities. This experience directly contradicted much of what she had likely been exposed to through popular Western discourse, where Islam is frequently painted as rigid, oppressive, or hostile. Instead, she discovered a text rich in compassion, reflection, and universal wisdom, a text that gave meaning to suffering and direction to kindness. What Jolie discovered, in essence, was that sacred texts do not always behave the way their critics assume. She found that the Quran did not glorify violence, but rather warned against injustice. It did not marginalize women, but elevated their dignity and humanity. It did not demand blind obedience, but called constantly for reflection, learning, and sincerity. Far from promoting hatred, the Quran urged restraint, forgiveness, and the seeking of peace wherever possible. These discoveries were not filtered through commentary or apologetics. They came straight from the text. And for Jolie, that made all the difference. This experience also exposed the deep gap between perception and reality that plagues much of the West's relationship with Islam. Many in Western societies, including people in positions of power, have never read the Quran and yet feel entitled to speak authoritatively about it. They rely on headlines, political rhetoric, or selective quotes taken wildly out of context. This has contributed to widespread Islamophobia and a cultural climate where billions of Muslims are judged not by their character or actions, but by the perceived meaning of their sacred book. Jolie's personal reading acted as a kind of quiet protest against this superficiality. It suggested that if one is truly interested in understanding a people or a faith, then one must begin by engaging directly with their sources, not the interpretations of their enemies. There is something intellectually courageous about this. Jolie, a public figure with a vast and diverse following, risked the criticism that often comes with expressing respect for Islam. She could have chosen silence or safe generalities. Instead, she acknowledged that the Quran gave her a deeper understanding of human suffering and mercy. In doing so, she demonstrated that empathy and learning require humility. She did not approach the Quran as a project to be dissected or criticized, but as a text that might have something to teach, even someone like her, from a completely different background. What's particularly powerful is that her experience suggests you don't need to be Muslim to be moved by the Quran. You don't have to agree with every doctrine to be touched by its moral and spiritual depth. Jolie's encounter with the Quran was not about conversion. It was about comprehension. It was about recognizing that wisdom can come from unfamiliar places and that truth is not limited by cultural or religious borders. This is especially important in a world increasingly divided by ideological and cultural echo chambers. Her experience reminds us that we can and must look beyond our own frameworks if we are to foster real understanding. This also raises an important point about the role of public figures in shaping cultural conversations. Jolie's willingness to speak respectfully about the Quran provided a counter-narrative to the prevailing assumptions in many Western spaces. While not a religious authority, her voice carries influence, And in choosing to use that voice to challenge misconceptions, she modeled what responsible curiosity looks like. She showed that learning about another religion is not an act of betrayal to your own values. It is an act of openness and maturity. Furthermore, Jolie's relationship with the Quran has broader implications for interfaith dialogue and secular engagement with religious texts. In academic and cultural circles, it is often assumed that only believers have the right or ability to understand a sacred text. But Jolie's case shows that respectful reading from a place of empathy and humanitarian concern can also lead to deep insight. In many ways, her humanitarian lens enriched her understanding of the Quran, because she was not reading it in a vacuum. She was reading it in the context of human pain, resilience, and hope. She saw the Quran not just as a book of belief, but as a living moral compass in the lives of millions. This perspective is vital for countering the tide of dehumanization that often accompanies religious or cultural ignorance. When someone like Angelina Jolie speaks about the Quran as a source of mercy, it challenges people to rethink their assumptions. It doesn't mean everyone will agree or suddenly change their views, but it opens the door. It creates space for curiosity to replace contempt, for reading to replace judging, and for empathy to replace fear. In the end, what Jolie's experience with the Quran teaches is simple but profound. That understanding begins with listening, not with arguing, not with defending or attacking, but with the humble act of turning a page and letting the words speak for themselves. When we do that, even the most foreign ideas can become surprisingly familiar. And in a world so desperately in need of healing, perhaps that is where hope begins. Not with grand policies or perfect ideologies, but with the quiet courage to read, to reflect, and to feel. Ladies and gentlemen, in a time where headlines breed fear, where misunderstanding festers like a wound left untended, and where sacred texts are often misquoted before they are ever read, we find in Angelina Jolie's journey something truly rare: honest engagement. Her experience with the Quran wasn't about religion in the narrow sense. It was about empathy. It was about seeking wisdom in a world collapsing under the weight of its own cruelty. It was about seeing suffering not as a dead end, but as a deeply human condition worthy of reflection and response. Jolie found in the Quran what many critics overlook: a profound acknowledgement of pain, a reverence for mercy, and a divine insistence on justice through compassion. Through this sacred text, she didn't just learn about Muslims, she learned about people. About the endurance of the human spirit, about patience that does not whimper but roars quietly with grace, and about mercy that stands tall even when surrounded by ashes. Her story is not about converting faiths. It is about converting perspectives. It reminds us that the Quran is not a book of war, but a book of warning and healing, of moral struggle and personal growth. It does not glorify violence, it condemns injustice. It does not suppress mercy, it elevates it as the highest virtue, and more than anything it invites us, all of us, to do better, to read before we judge, to understand before we dismiss, and to meet pain not with arrogance or ignorance, but with the kind of courage that Angelina Jolie showed, the courage to learn from others even when their truths challenge our own. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us take this lesson seriously, because in a world full of noise, false narratives and lazy generalizations. The quiet act of reading with an open heart may be the most radical and merciful thing we can do. Thank you.